Next up in Chapter 9 is factoring trinomials. So remember, a trinomial is something that has three terms, and factoring means undistributing. So I can undistribute something with three terms. So before we do that, let's warm up our brain with a little thinking. Find two numbers that add to 7 and multiply to 12. So hopefully these numbers are sticking out in your head and you can come up with them right away. But if you don't have these numbers memorized, there are literally infinite numbers that add to 7. You got 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4, but then like your negatives, or 7 and 0, or -1 and 8, like we could literally go on all day. But there's only a few numbers that multiply to make 12. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. That's it. And then combinations of negatives there. So then once you have these factors of 12, which ones add to make 7? And 3 and 4 are the numbers that work. Same thing with this one. I want two numbers that add to make 1 and multiply to make 90. And it has to be a -90. So we know one of the numbers is negative. So break down 90. You have 90 and 1. You have 2 and 45. You have 3 and 30. 4 doesn't go into it. 5 goes into it 18 times. 6 doesn't go into it. 7 doesn't go into it. 8 doesn't go into it, but 9 does, and it goes into it 10 times. And then that's it, because we'd be back at 10. So I want a combination of these numbers to add to +1. 90 and 1 aren't going to do it. 45 and 2 aren't. Finally, we get down to here. 10 and 9 will. And because we want them to add to +1, we want to make the 9 negative. So then how about 50? Let's break that down. We got 50 and 1, 25 and 2. 3 doesn't go into it. 4 doesn't go into it. 5 does 10 times. 6 can't. 7 can't. 8 can't. 9 can't. So we're back at 10. These are the only factors of 50. That's the only possibility. We want them to add to a -15. So the numbers that are going to do that are 10 and 5, and we got to make both of them negative. Two negative numbers, remember, multiply to make a positive number, but they would still add to make -15. So keep this skill in the back of your mind, because we will definitely need it for the rest of this chapter. So remember, factoring is the opposite of multiplying. So let's go through multiplication and kind of refresh our memory as to what's happening. For something like this, we would double distribute. So we'd do x times x, x times 2, and then we would do -10 times x, and -10 times 2. And then we have these terms right here that can be simplified. -8x minus 20. And that would be our answer. Today we're going to go backwards. I am going to give you that, and you need to tell me that it breaks down into x minus 10 times x plus 2. So what we need to do is we need to get it back to this 4-term polynomial, because when something's in 4 terms, we know how to factor it. We can factor by grouping. So we need to undo this part here. We need to somehow break that -8 up. And we can't just break it up into anything we want, because if we don't break it up into 2 and -10 like it is up here, we can't factor it. So how do we know what to break it up into? This is where that skill that we just learned comes in handy. What we want are two numbers that add to this number in the middle. And remember, that's because you're going to combine them to get to that number in the middle. And we want them to multiply to this number that's out here, this -20. 2 and -10 multiply to make -20. So you stop and you rack your brain. What numbers do this? And break down 20. 20 can be broken into 1 and 20, 2 and 10. 3 doesn't go into it, 4 goes into it 5 times, and then we're out of factors. So this combination here, the only one that can add or subtract to 8 is this guy here, 2 and 10. So now we want it to add to -8 and multiply to -20. So when we're giving these guys signs, we want to make it a -10. So these numbers here that we just found, this -2 and 10, tells us how we can break up this -8. So we just get to rewrite this as positive 2x minus 10x minus 20. So all we did right now was turn this into a 4-term polynomial. It still means exactly the same thing. It would simplify to this if we combined our like terms. But now we can factor by grouping. So you say, what do these guys have in common? Well, they have an x. X times x gives me x squared, and x times 2 gives me 2x. And then what do those guys have in common? Well, they both have a -10. I'm left with x plus 2. And remember, you know you did something right if these two terms are the same. And then what's left over is x minus 10. And we're done. So let's try some all on our own. So when we look at this, we know we have to break this 7g up. But we have to break it up in a special way. So we want two numbers that add to 7, and those same two numbers have to multiply to make that 10 every single time. So stop and think about your numbers that multiply to make 10. You have 1 and 10, 2 and 5, and that's it. So the ones that are going to add up to make 7 are 2 and 5. You don't have to worry about signs for anything, but remember the 2 and 5 tell me how I can break this 7 up. And it doesn't matter which way you write this, because it'll all end up working out no matter what. So remember, this means exactly the same thing, only we broke it up into 4 terms so that we can factor by grouping. Now this group I can take out a 5, and I'm left with g plus 2. So g plus 2 is in common, and what's left over is g plus 5. We can check our answers, because if I double distribute these out, I should end up with this here. Let's do C. So same story. I want two numbers. They have to add to make the number in the middle and multiply to make the number on the end. So if we break down 30, we end up with 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. The ones that add up to 13 are 3 and 10. Remember, those tell us how we can break up this 13. 10a plus 30. And then factor by grouping. If you try factoring by grouping and it doesn't end up working, that means you did not find the correct combination here. So you can pull out a 10. And good thing we're left with the same stuff. You get 8 plus 10. So let's try ones that are a little bit harder. If you noticed, all of these had a 1 in front of this squared term. That makes your life a lot easier. Unfortunately, not all of them are that easy. So if we think about multiplying something like this, when you multiply the first terms together, that changed this up here, but then it also changed everything here. You didn't just get your terms that were in here, you got multiples of your terms. So again, you started with something that had 4 terms, you simplified, and now we got to go backwards. So I'm giving you this. Again, we have to find something that breaks this 11 up, but breaks it up correctly. So the only difference with this is we have to take the 6 into account. So now we want two numbers. They still have to add to make the number in the middle, so 11. But we want them to multiply to 6 times 4, or 24. And stop and think about this. 8 and 3 add to make 11. But if you multiply 8 and 3, you get 24. So the 8 and the 3 are the numbers we want. And remember, that tells us how to break this up. and then we can factor by grouping. So these guys together, I can pull out a 2x. And these guys here don't have anything in common, which means I can pull out a 1. And I'm left with 3x plus 4. So then I pull out a 3x plus 4, and 2x plus 1 is left over. And that's what we started with over here. So now let's do one on our own. Factor each expression. So the beginning step is almost the same. We want two numbers. They have to combine to make the number in the middle, because remember, those two terms combine to make that one. But this time we want them to multiply to make 2 times 2, or 4. So you start breaking down your number. 4 can be 4 and 1, or 2 and 2. And the combination that adds to make 5 is 4 and 1. So that's what I'm going to use, is a 4 and a 1. And just like before, you break this up. And then we can factor by grouping. So I can pull out a 2y here, and I'm left with y plus 2. Just like the last one, those guys don't have anything in common, so I'm going to pull out a 1, and I'm left with y plus 2. Both of those terms have a y plus 2, and 2y plus 1 is left over. And just like I had said before, you can check your answer. If you double distribute this out, you should end up with what we started with. So let's try this other one. Let's do B. So we want two numbers. They got to add to make the number in the middle, and they got to multiply to make 6 times 7. So stop and break down your 42. 42 and 1. 2 goes into this 21 times. And then 3 goes into it 14 times. 4 doesn't fit into it, 5 doesn't fit into it, and we know 6 and 7 do. We want to somehow add or subtract these numbers to end up with negative 23. So the only combination that can do that is 21 and 2. And because it multiplies to make a positive number but adds to make a negative, we're going to make them both negative. Negative 21 and negative 2. Remember, all that tells us is what we can break that 23n into. And then you factor by grouping. So I can pull out a 3n, and I'm left with 2n minus 7. Here, I can't pull anything out, but because this first one's negative, remember that means pull out a negative 1, and you're left with 2n minus 7. So 2n minus 7 is in common, and 3n minus 1 is left over. And we're done. So you should be able to factor some trinomials. Try these two all on your own. Write down any questions you have, and we can go over them in class. Enjoy your night.